Have you ever wondered why the Bible remains completely silent about Jesus' life between the ages of 12 and 30? 13 chapters in the Gospel of Luke suddenly stop, and then, out of nowhere, Jesus reappears, an adult, wise, full of authority, preaching like no one ever had before. Where did that wisdom come from? What happened during those 18 hidden years? Why did the church never tell us? Ancient texts, apocryphal writings, and historical records could change everything you thought you knew about the Messiah. Some claim that Jesus traveled to India, Tibet, Egypt, that he learned from sages of other religions, that he meditated, healed, and taught long before returning to Galilee. And if that's true, why keep it hidden? What is being concealed from people of faith? Get ready. What you're about to discover in this video is not a modern theory or a shallow conspiracy. These are religious curiosities that have been suppressed, silenced, and considered dangerous for centuries, because they might prove that Jesus underwent a much deeper and more universal spiritual preparation than we were ever taught. And if you too feel that something is missing, that the story is incomplete, then stay with us. This video may forever change the way you see Jesus. More than 80% of people who watch our videos are not subscribed. If you believe that faith should go beyond what we were always told, subscribe right now, hit the like button, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Together, let's uncover the deepest secrets of sacred history. The Bible is not a book that usually leaves gaps. Every word is filled with purpose, with history, with promise. Yet when we speak of Jesus, the central figure of the entire Christian faith, we encounter a silence that unsettles anyone who looks closely. How is it possible that we know nothing about Jesus' life between the ages of 12 and 30? 18 years of complete silence. A boy who amazed the scholars in the temple at just 12 years old. And then, nothing. Not a line, not a story, not even a whisper. Isn't that suspicious? How could the very period in which a man forms his character, grows in wisdom, and prepares for his mission be completely erased? For many traditional theologians, that silence is simply considered ordinary time. They say Jesus lived as a carpenter quietly, without need for record, but that clashes with the image of a Jesus who suddenly appears with such profound wisdom that he stuns multitudes, with authority over the scriptures, over spirits, over sickness, and even over death. Where did all of that come from? Learned in a carpenter's workshop? It's hard to believe. Even the gospel writers seem to deliberately skip over those years. And in a book that doesn't omit trivial details like patriarchal genealogies, this silence weighs like a warning. But when we open our eyes and look beyond the official canon, we discover that not everyone remained silent. Some apocryphal texts, like the Gospel of Thomas the Israelite or the Tibetan manuscript, mention a young Jesus who travels, who seeks, who learns, a Jesus who didn't remain in Nazareth, but who embarked on a spiritual journey to distant lands. These texts, of course, were branded heretical, and yet their very existence raises an uncomfortable question. What if they weren't eliminated for being false, but for revealing too much? Imagine for a moment that Jesus, in his youth, was guided by God to explore other cultures, other teachings, not to stray from the truth, but to understand it more deeply, that his preparation wasn't limited to Jewish tradition, but embraced a universal spiritual search. That wouldn't reduce his divinity. On the contrary, it would reveal the depth of his humanity and his desire to redeem all of humanity from within his own experience. And perhaps that's why this silence so deeply unsettles religious institutions, because it opens doors, because it invites us to think, because it awakens a living, questioning, searching faith. Silence sometimes speaks louder than words, and in the case of Jesus, that silence calls us to seek, to ask what happened during those years, to not settle for half a story. Because if there's one thing faith teaches us, It's that God reveals himself to those who hunger for more. Could it be that those lost years are simply waiting for someone like you to start finding them? Many people think Egypt only appears in the story of Moses or the Exodus, but the truth is, Egypt also played a role in the childhood of the Messiah. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 2, verses 13 to 15, it is clearly stated that Joseph took the child Jesus and Mary and fled to Egypt to escape Herod's massacre. Arise, take the child and his mother, flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, said the angel to Joseph in a dream. This was not a short visit nor a casual stop. It was a sacred residence, a formative stage. Jesus lived in Egypt for years, and that's where the first clues of his mysterious preparation begin. In Egyptian lands, Jesus wasn't just safe. He was surrounded by an ancient mystical culture filled with spiritual knowledge, astronomy, medicine, and hidden wisdom. Can we really believe that this divine child, full of sacred curiosity, absorbed nothing from what surrounded him? Let us remember, Egypt was no ordinary place. It was the heart of ancient knowledge, where sages, healers, and scribes studied the mysteries of the soul and the cosmos. What if Jesus learned in that environment? What if his time in Egypt was much more than just refuge? Some Coptic traditions, the oldest branch of Egyptian Christianity, claim that the child Jesus performed miracles even during his time there. Stories tell of him blessing water sources, healing people, and transforming places by his presence. These records, though often labeled folklore by modern theologians, have been preserved with reverence by entire communities. What if they're not just legends? What if they contain fragments of a truth that official history chose to ignore? Moreover, Egypt was home to ancient manuscripts, including early Gnostic writings. Who can say with certainty that Jesus never came into contact with texts like the Book of Wisdom, Hermetic teachings, or desert parables that circulated among Egyptian hermits? When we see the depth of his parables in the Gospels, so full of symbolism and metaphor, doesn't it seem like there's a more ancient and universal root behind them? To think of Jesus as a prodigious child in Egypt not only expands our understanding of his early life, it reveals that even from a young age, God was opening his heart to the whole world. And maybe it was that early exposure to the wisdom of the nations that prepared him to speak with shepherds, with sages, with sinners, and with kings, with an authority no one could deny. If Egypt was the first stage of his formation, then his message was always global, always divine, and never limited by borders. While many imagine Jesus growing up quietly in Nazareth, some ancient texts suggest something entirely different. In the northern mountains of India, among Buddhist monasteries and pilgrimage routes, there are accounts of a holy man who came from the west. His name, Isa. According to the Ladakh manuscript, discovered by a Russian doctor named Nicholas Notovich in the 19th century, Jesus is said to have traveled to the Himalayas during his youth, seeking wisdom among the Brahmins and Lamas. Could it be true? Could Jesus of Nazareth have walked among the sages of India? Notovich's records, which claim that Jesus lived and taught in Tibet and India for several years, were harshly criticized and dismissed by the church. However, Tibetan monks confirmed that such texts did exist. They describe a radiant young man who preached love, humility, and compassion, who studied the Vedas, condemned animal sacrifices, and was persecuted by Brahmins for preaching equality among castes. Does that message sound familiar to you? Isn't that the very essence of what Jesus later taught in the Gospels? The possibility that Jesus learned from Hindu and Buddhist masters doesn't diminish his divinity, it magnifies it. It shows him as a tireless seeker, a young man thirsty for truth, willing to cross deserts and mountains to encounter the heart of God beyond cultural boundaries. In India, ideas like the God within, detachment from materialism, forgiveness of one's enemies, and the practice of meditation were already well known. Is it really far-fetched to think that such concepts might have influenced the Jesus who later said, "The kingdom of God is within you"? Luke 17:21. And when we consider that, at the time, there were active trade routes between the Middle East and India, the journey of a young truth seeker wasn't just possible, it was likely. Historical records confirm the existence of Jewish communities in India centuries before Christ. A young man like Jesus, traveling with merchants or scholars, could easily have reached the Ganges and lived there in deep contemplation and study, and if he returned to Galilee with teachings that merged the wisdom of East and West, that would explain much of his universal language. So then, why was this story buried? Because it threatens a version of Jesus crafted entirely by the West, by councils, by structures, by institutions. But the real Jesus was never bound by human doctrine. He was free, spiritual, mystical, revolutionary. And if he truly walked through India, then his message is broader, deeper, and more urgent than ever. While in the West, they searched for him among temples and synagogues, some believed that Jesus was far away, among the rooftops of the world, in the mountains of Tibet, hidden among lamas and millennia-old monasteries. He may have discovered a path of silence, contemplation, and profound spiritual power. The figure of Saint Isa not only appears in Indian tradition, but also in Tibetan sources that speak of a foreigner who astonished the monks with his compassion, wisdom, and deep understanding of the human soul. Was Jesus that silent pilgrim, walking through eternal snows, seeking the face of God in solitude? Tibet is not just a geographical region, it's a spiritual symbol, a place where the outer world fades and the inner world speaks loudly. There, among ancient rituals, sacred chants and meditative practices that pursue enlightenment, Jesus could have discovered techniques we now call alternative, but which actually touch the very core of the spirit. Breathing techniques, deep introspection, fasting, total connection with creation. Does that sound strange to you? Haven't we seen echoes of this when Jesus retreats to the desert for 40 days, when he prays in silence, when he says, "Go into your room, shut the door, and pray to your Father in secret"? What's most surprising is that many Tibetan teachings align with Jesus' own words: compassion as the path to redemption, the renunciation of ego, forgiveness as the key to freedom, selfless service. Is it coincidence or evidence of an encounter between two ancient spiritual traditions? Some Tibetan manuscripts speak of a man with a serene face and eyes of fire, who healed with his hands and spoke of the one true God. That man, they say, left suddenly, leaving behind a legacy of hope and transformation. Of course, speaking of Jesus in Tibet is uncomfortable for those who defend a limited vision of the gospel, because it would mean admitting that the Christ was also a student, that he allowed himself to be taught, that he sought in other traditions what many today reject out of religious pride. But isn't that what makes us human? The humility to learn, even as the Son of God. Perhaps Jesus didn't just come to teach us with words, but through his own example of seeking, surrender, and openness. To picture Jesus walking among Tibetan monks, listening to mantras, contemplating the universe from the top of the world, is not heresy, it's a revelation. It shows us a savior who didn't just wait passively, but who went out in search of sacred knowledge wherever it could be found. And if he did, why should we settle for comfortable answers? When Jesus reappears in the Gospels at the age of 30, he is no longer the boy in the temple. He is a man full of authority, speaking as no one ever had before, healing with a word, casting out demons by his mere presence, forgiving sins and transforming hearts. But where did that authority come from? Who gave it to him? Where did he acquire it? There are no records of formal study in rabbinical schools. He wasn't a Pharisee or a scribe, and yet his teaching carried more weight than any master of his time. Which leads us to an unavoidable question. Did he learn things that aren't in the Bible? Some researchers believe that Jesus gained access to mystical teachings during his lost years, deep doctrines that didn't fit into traditional Judaism and therefore were silenced. Have you noticed how often Jesus speaks in parables? He himself says in Matthew 13:11, "To you it has been given to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given." That implies the existence of reserved knowledge, mysteries, teachings not accessible to everyone. What if some of those truths came from his journeys to India, Tibet, or even Egypt? These hidden teachings weren't heresies, as they were later labeled. They were profound truths that required spiritual maturity. Jesus spoke of the light within, the power of thought, forgiveness as liberation, and love as the supreme law. He didn't just preach external rules, he preached inner transformation. Some apocryphal gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas, contain sayings that echo a universal wisdom. The kingdom is inside you and outside you. Can you imagine the impact of such a message in an age ruled by rigid dogma and empty rituals? But those truths were dangerous to the system because they set people free, because they declared that you didn't need stone temples or human priests to approach God, that the true temple was within your own heart, that the kingdom didn't come with visible signs, it was already within you. That wasn't just a spiritual teaching, it was a threat to the religious structures of power. That's why many of his sayings were omitted, others rewritten, and some completely buried by councils and church hierarchies. Today, more than 2,000 years later, those teachings are starting to resurface because humanity is awakening, because the thirst for truth is stronger than fear. And if Jesus underwent a mystical preparation, if he spoke of soul secrets, if he taught a path of spiritual awakening, then we have the duty to rediscover it. Not to create new religions, but to return to the pure origin of the message, the transformation of the self through love, consciousness, and direct connection with God. When Jesus finally returns to Galilee, he is no longer the child who fled with his parents years before, nor is he a common young carpenter. He is a man full of presence, with a penetrating gaze and words that shake the soul. The Gospels present him as someone who taught with authority and not like the scribes, Matthew 7:29. But no one stops to ask, where did that authority come from? Why did the other religious teachers listen to him with fear and sometimes envy? The answer isn't found in Joseph's carpentry shop. It lies in what the Bible does not tell us: his return after years of secret formation. Galilee was a marginalized region, despised by religious centers like Jerusalem. Can anything good come out of Galilee? They said. And yet that's where Jesus chose to begin his mission. Not among the great, but among the forgotten. Not in the temples, but in the streets, the beaches, and the local synagogues. But this return was far more than geographic. It was the return of a fully initiated teacher, of someone who had drunk from many wells of wisdom, who had seen the world, who had witnessed human suffering in many cultures, and who now brought a universal truth that could reach any heart. Interestingly, the Gospels record a sort of cultural shock between Jesus and his own people. In Mark 6:3-4, his neighbors say, "Isn't this the carpenter, the son of Mary?" And they were offended by him. In other words, they couldn't understand how someone they'd known as a mere child could now speak with such depth. Some believed, others rejected him, but everyone was astonished. No one could deny that something powerful had happened to him, something that defied all conventional explanation. Something that only makes sense if we accept that during those lost years, Jesus underwent intense and transformative spiritual preparation. His return also marks the beginning of a mission without borders. From Galilee, he begins to choose disciples, to heal the sick, to speak of the kingdom of heaven with an authority that needed no lineage, no title. Jesus doesn't ask permission from religious authorities. He doesn't seek human validation. He speaks because he has seen. He teaches because he has lived. And that force, that fire burning within him, was not born of theoretical study, but of a deep experience with the divine gained in the silence of the hidden years. So when we see him in Galilee walking among fishermen, touching lepers, breaking religious norms, we are not seeing an improviser. We are witnessing the Christ returning from his personal desert, from his secret exodus, ready to ignite the world with a flame that still has not gone out. And that return, that rebirth, is also an invitation for us, because we all, at some point, must return, not to a physical place, but to our purpose, to the calling, to the mission we were being shaped for, even in the silence. Speaking about the lost years of Jesus is walking into a territory that makes many uncomfortable, not because of a lack of evidence or theories, but because that silence touches a deep wound within institutional Christianity. Why did the church never teach us anything about those 18 years? Why is there no mention of the travels, the learning beyond Israel, the apocryphal accounts and ancient traditions that describe Jesus as a spiritual pilgrim? The answer, though painful, is clear, because acknowledging it would mean losing control over the official narrative. And for centuries, that was unacceptable. The story of Jesus has been carefully shaped by councils, dogmas, and power structures. From the Council of Nicaea to the formation of the biblical canon, everything we know today as the gospel was selected, edited, and in many cases, filtered to maintain a single image. A divine, Jewish Messiah, predictable, born to fulfill prophecy, and nothing more. Anything that made him appear too human, too curious, too questioning, or influenced by other cultures was seen as a threat. And what could be more dangerous than a Jesus, who was once a student before becoming the master? Accepting that Jesus spent years abroad, learning from other traditions, would imply that the truth of God is not limited to one religion or one interpretation. It would mean opening the door to a freer, more spiritual, less dogmatic form of Christianity, and that has always been a threat to the systems of control built around faith. That's why the lost years were turned into forbidden years, forced silence, censorship disguised as omission. Moreover, admitting the existence of Jesus's hidden teachings or even mystical experiences not found in the canonical Gospels would challenge the Church's exclusive authority over the interpretation of faith. No longer would only theologians or priests hold the keys to truth, but every soul seeking God sincerely. That breaks the hierarchy. That democratizes the sacred. And in the history of religion, spiritual democratization has always been viewed as a threat. But today, we live in a different time, a time of awakening, a generation no longer satisfied with what it's told, but one that searches for itself. And it is precisely that hunger for truth that is bringing light back to the years that others tried to keep in the shadows. Because when something is true, sooner or later, it finds its way back into the light. Though the New Testament remains silent about Jesus' lost years, there are other texts, ancient, forgotten, and even forbidden, that dared to tell what the Church never wanted to accept. These are writings that were excluded from the Bible by the decision of ecclesiastical councils. Yet they survived for centuries, hidden in caves, monasteries, and remote libraries. And many of them agree on something astonishing. Jesus did not spend his youth entirely in Nazareth. He traveled, he learned, he taught. He was more than a carpenter. He was a tireless seeker of truth. One of the most well-known is the Gospel of Thomas, a text discovered in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, in 1945. While it doesn't directly narrate Jesus' travels, it contains deeply mystical teachings that reflect a very different kind of preparation. Sayings like, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you," or the kingdom is inside of you and outside of you, point to a level of spiritual awareness that many link to Eastern traditions. These words are not found in the canonical Gospels, yet they carry the voice of someone who has lived a profound inner transformation. Another intriguing testimony comes from the Ladakh manuscript referenced by Russian traveler Nicholas Notovich, who claimed to have found in a Tibetan monastery records of a wise man named Issa, a name that in several Semitic languages means Jesus. According to those texts, Issa defended the oppressed, spoke of love and forgiveness, and openly challenged corrupt priests. Sound familiar? The Church was quick to dismiss these documents as forgeries, yet never presented conclusive proof against them. Then there are the apocryphal Gospels of Jesus' childhood, like the infancy Gospel of Thomas, which narrate episodes of young Jesus performing extraordinary acts, displaying precocious wisdom, and even working miracles before his public ministry began. Though sometimes embellished with mythical detail, these writings point to one unshakable idea. Jesus was special from a very young age, and his life was not as ordinary as we've been led to believe. Each of these texts taken individually might seem questionable, but together they form a pattern, an echo, a truth trying to break through. So why were they forbidden? Because they destabilize, because they don't fit the carefully crafted image built over centuries, because they show a Jesus who is active, rebellious, enlightened, and deeply human. A Jesus who breaks molds, who questions, who walks outside the temple to find God in the real world. These texts don't deny his divinity, they enrich it. They show us that the Son of God was also a disciple, also a seeker, also a soul who grew through experience. And that makes him all the more relatable to us. Maybe the time has come to stop fearing what these writings reveal. Not to replace the Gospels, but to understand them more fully. Because sometimes the deepest truths are not found in official books, but in the whispers that survived fire, dust, and centuries of silence. For centuries, speaking of Jesus in connection with other religions has been almost taboo. And yet, if we closely observe his message, his gestures, and his teachings, we begin to hear echoes that reach far beyond the Judaism of his time. Jesus spoke of unconditional love, non-violence, detachment from material things, and deep communion between the human soul and the Creator. Don't these principles sound familiar? Similar to Buddhism, Hinduism, even Taoism. Could it be that Jesus didn't just come to fulfill the law of the prophets, but to unite scattered wisdom into one eternal message? In the Gospel of John 10:16, Jesus says, "I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. There will be one flock, one shepherd." What did he mean by that? Many have interpreted it as a sign of universalism. Jesus knew that the truth of God could not be confined within religious walls, that the Creator does not belong to any single doctrine. And maybe that's why his message resonated so deeply, even in cultures that never met him in person, because his spirit, that unquenchable fire, is recognizable in every sincere soul that longs for truth. The possibility that Jesus studied and lived among teachers of other religions does not weaken his message. It strengthens it. It gives it depth and richness that explain his global impact. It's no coincidence that in many spiritual traditions he is honored as a prophet, a master, a divine figure. In Islam, he is considered one of the greatest prophets. In some branches of Hinduism, he's seen as an avatar of the divine. In Buddhism, certain Tibetan monks refer to him as the Bodhisattva of the West. How can we explain such reverence if his life had been confined only to Galilee? The truth is, Jesus didn't come to create a religion. He came to open a path, and that path, though born in a specific land, has roots that touch many traditions. Because God is not the property of an institution, he is the source of all. Jesus didn't divide, he united. He didn't exclude, he welcomed. He didn't speak of empty rituals, but of inner transformation. That's why his message can speak with Eastern sages, desert wanderers, and contemplatives across all ages. When we understand this, our faith expands. It becomes deeper, more mature, more compassionate. We no longer fear dialogue with other religions. In fact, we seek it, because we know that all truth, no matter where it comes from, is God's truth. And if Jesus encountered other cultures, if he learned from them, if he recognized the Creator's fingerprints in them, then we too are called to see the world with those same eyes, with love, with openness, and with a heart ready to discover that divine light can shine where we least expect it. After everything we've explored, the lost years, the hidden journeys, the silenced teachings, the forbidden texts, one unavoidable question remains. What will you do with this information? Because this video isn't just a collection of curious facts or ancient theories. It's a calling, a whisper straight to your soul, an invitation to look at Jesus with new eyes and to look at your own faith with greater depth. If Jesus lived all of this, if he searched, if he was formed in silence, if he learned from sages of different cultures, then why couldn't you do the same? Maybe you were taught that asking questions was a lack of faith, that exploring the hidden was dangerous, that the truth had already been fully written, and there was nothing left to discover. But Jesus never taught that. He said, "Seek and you will find," Matthew 7:7. He blessed those who hungered for righteousness, who thirsted for truth, who burned with passion for the kingdom. His life was a testimony of spiritual pursuit, and his silence was a door waiting to be opened by those brave enough to knock. Your faith doesn't have to be small, rigid, or caged by fear. It can be vast, vibrant, alive. It can embrace mystery. It can reach beyond dogma without ever losing its essence. Jesus didn't come to impose religion. He came to offer relationship with God, with yourself, with others. If he crossed deserts, mountains, and cultures to find the truth, why would you settle for a shallow spirituality? Today is the time to awaken, to seek with all your heart, to question without fear, to let the Spirit guide you, even if it leads you down unexpected paths. And the most beautiful part is this: you are not alone. Millions of people just like you are feeling that there is more. That the official version of the story is not enough, that the gospel is far deeper than we were told, and in rediscovering the Jesus who searched, who traveled, who was mystical and universal, you also rediscover yourself, the purpose you were created for, a faith that doesn't live only in temples, but in every breath you take. So today, don't extinguish that flame that has been lit inside you. Feed it, study, pray, walk with God the way Jesus did, with hunger, with humility, with passion. Because maybe, just maybe, the greatest secret of those 30 lost years is that they were waiting for someone like you to rediscover them. Now that you've heard this story, the real question is no longer what Jesus did during those years. The real question is, what will you do with this truth? We can no longer live a faith based only on what we were allowed to know. There is more, so much more. And you feel it, you know it. The story is incomplete, and the spiritual hunger of this generation demands deeper answers, not hollow repetitions. That's why I invite you to reflect, to question, to seek for yourself. Do not fear the silence, because often that is where God speaks the loudest. Jesus wasn't afraid to walk non-traditional paths, so why should you be? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe that Jesus truly traveled beyond the biblical borders? Are you willing to look beyond what you've always been told? And if this journey resonated with you, if you feel that this message touched your soul, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because this is only the beginning. We are going to keep uncovering what others chose to silence, Together, we will ignite a faith that can no longer be suppressed. I'll see you in the next video. There, I'll reveal another truth you may have never imagined.